It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at studiobrainstorm.net and Smashwords, links in the description. The Tyranids are by far the deadliest Xenos race in all of Warhammer 40k. The appearance of a Tyranid hive fleet spells certain doom for the luckless world that falls within its shadow. No matter what defenses the native inhabitants can bring to bear, the hive fleet can counter with an almost infinite variety of bioforms, each tailor-made for a specific fight. In my previous video, I pointed out several similarities between the Tyranids and the Orcs. However, there is one crucial distinction. The Orcs fight purely for its own sake, and that is why they seek out the strongest opponents. They want the fight to be as hard as possible, so as to prove that they are stronger and because it will make them stronger. The Tyranids, however, are predators, and like predators in the wild, they prefer weak targets. And since the targets of the Tyranids are usually whole planetary societies, the weakest targets are often those that are unable to defend themselves. Say, because the targets are busy fighting among themselves. In such case, the question facing the hive mind is, how do you ensure that conditions on your target planet will be as confused and divided as possible? Enter the Tyranid-Genestealer. The Imperium has been aware of the existence of Genestealers at least as far back as Millennia 36, but until recently had thought them a distinct Xenos species native to the moons of Imgarl, and would usually hop aboard floating space hulks in order to infest other planets. It wasn't until the end of the First Tyrannic War, when the Adeptus Mechanicus, specifically the Magi Biologus, examined the Tyranid corpses left behind, that they were able to confirm that the Genestealers were in fact part of the Tyranid species. Genestealers are introduced to a planetary population usually in one of two ways. Either they are introduced via mycetic spore, essentially the Tyranid version of an armored drop pod, or the aforementioned Space Hulk. Space Hulks are essentially artificial accretions formed by multiple space vessels lost in the warp, smashing and mushing together into one ugly mass of metallic insanity. They drop in and out of the warp at random because the warp, and Genestealers are only one of the many horrific nasty things that you might find if you dare to go poking around inside. Either way, the moment they arrive on planet, the Genestealers will immediately head off for the nearest population center. For the most part, Genestealers aren't that much different from the typical Gaunt, the average Tyranid infantry unit. There are, however, three critical differences. One is that Genestealers usually have hardened, tougher exoskeletons than Gaunts, allowing them to survive in more hostile environments. Second, their claws are known for being unusually sharp. According to the testimony of many witnesses, including the legendary hero of the Imperium Commissar Caiaphas Cain, the claws of a Genestealer can tear through the ceramite plate of Space Marine Terminators. But the third and most important distinction is the unusual bulbous head of the Genestealer. Because unlike the Gaunt, which is primarily a combat unit, the Genestealer is an infiltration unit, and therefore requires a greater brain and the greater intellect that goes with it. Having reached its destination, the Genestealer then begins lying in wait for suitable targets. Once said target comes into range, the Genestealer then attacks and hits them with its ovipositor, essentially similar to an egg-laying tube that you find in certain reptile species. Only instead of eggs, a portion of Tyranid genetic material is implanted inside the host body. The implant then proceeds to rewire the host genetically and behaviorally. The genetic alteration causes the host to become susceptible to the brood mind, a kind of simulacrum of the Tyranid hive mind usually projected by the Genestealers themselves. The behavioral modification is mostly to increase the host's sex drive. Every single person that the host has intercourse with in turn becomes infected by the Genestealer DNA. They in turn spread the infection to the next person that they have intercourse with, and so on exponentially. Of course, eventually, with all this copulating, pregnancy occurs, and then the first Genestealer hybrids are born. Now, your average first-generation hybrid is a pretty ugly monster-looking thing, and the Imperium has strict religious prohibitions against mutations. Normally, a human child born with mutations that are far too drastic to be concealed would usually be killed by the parents, either out of piety or out of simple fear that if they are ever caught harboring a mutant, which are heretics by default, they themselves will end up on the burning stake along with their child. This time, however, the Genestealer behavior modification kicks in, and the parents become obsessed with protecting and raising their hideous monster children. Luckily, first-generation hybrids grow very quickly and are soon able to strike out on their own. Usually they go into hiding, either in the underhive levels of a hive city, or into the wilderness if they happen to be on a less industrial planet. The first-generation hybrids, of course, have the same overpowering sex drive as their parents, and so eventually you get second-generation hybrids, which look a little more human, but are still far too mutated to be seen in public. Only when you get to third-generation hybrids do you have Genestealer hybrids that can conceal themselves in human society, usually by wearing baggy clothes or sticking to dark alleys whenever possible. Finally, fourth-generation hybrids are almost indistinguishable from baseline humanity, except for the fact that they usually have a mauve or pinkish tint to their skin, might have unusually sharp nails and teeth, and are almost always bald, lending further credence to Major Kill's pet theory that the true sign of evil in 40k is baldness. A fourth-generation hybrid with potent psychic abilities is referred to as a magus, and usually wields a lot of influence within the, by now, extensive Genestealer cult. Then we come to the fifth generation, and whereas the previous generations became progressively more human-like in appearance, the fifth generation of Genestealer hybrid is in fact not a hybrid at all. This go-around, the offspring is pure Genestealer, and in fact is referred to as a pure strain. As soon as they are mature, the pure strains then go out into the environment and, like the original Genestealers, find human hosts to infect and so perpetuate the cycle. Eventually, one of the pure strains, usually either the first or the largest, will start to develop into what is called a patriarch. Usually, the pure strain will grow in size and bulk, becoming an obese, bloated parody of a Genestealer Tyranid. More important than its size, however, the patriarch becomes the focal point of the cult's broodmind, and projects a psychic beacon that signals to any nearby hive fleets that this planet is ripe for the taking. Apart from the patriarch being the ultimate authority within the Genestealer cult, the organization and the culture of a Genestealer cult varies from world to world. This is because, until the Hive Fleet arrives, a cult's greatest asset is secrecy, and therefore they do their best to blend into the local populace. Beneath the Patriarch is a small cadre of fourth-generation hybrids, such as a Magus or a Primus hybrid. These serve as the public face of the cult, because they're the ones that can actually go out into the wider populace and not get burned alive for being mutant heretics. Under the direction of the Patriarch and this inner circle of ruling elites, the Genestealer cult usually tries to present itself as harmless. The baggy clothes that cultists often wear to hide their mutant deformities, they sell as religious modesty. Unusual levels of acceptance for funny-looking members of the family, they pass off as respect for the old and care for the young. Simple, decent, heartwarming virtues. In the deeply theocratic Imperium of Man, some of the most successful Genestealer cults have been those that are able to pass themselves off as just a variation of worshipping the Emperor. After all, so long as you profess the divinity of the Emperor and the supremacy of the human race, it's actually a little tricky for the Adeptus Ministorum to single you out and prove that you are guilty of heresy. Not that such things as guilt or proof matter all that much when the Inquisition is involved, but still. There are as many different ways of worshipping the God Emperor as there are worlds within the Imperium of Man. So it's not so unbelievable that the Church could look at the members of a Genestealer cult and mistake them for good, happy, normal Emperor botherers. In fact, many of the infected humans that are members of such Genestealer cults genuinely believe that they are worshipping the Emperor and are loyal to him, just in a different way from their neighbors. But whether or not a Genestealer cult is trying to pass itself off as Emperor worship, there is one thing that they all have in common: the belief in an incoming, impending apocalypse. Maybe they believe the Emperor will return someday. Maybe they believe that some vaguely defined saviors from the stars will come to elevate the worthy to their rightful place, a la the Rapture. Either way, the world is going to end, and when the day comes, the worthy shall be separated from the unworthy and elevated to their rightful place among the stars. Of course, this being the Tyranids, I think you can clearly see where this is going. This is essentially a prediction for the coming of the Hive fleet. What this means ultimately is that Genestealer cults are generally very militant. They are always preparing for the final battle, the Day of Judgment. And once the Hive fleet starts moving into the area and gets close enough for the Patriarch to pick up on it, he will give the signal via the Broodmind, and that's when the Genestealer cult begins its rebellion. And as I implied at the very beginning of this video, the purpose of the Genestealer cult is to destabilize the target world, to make sure that it is soft and unsuspecting and unprepared for when the Tyranid Hive fleet actually arrives. Genestealer uprisings can range from random terrorist attacks to full-blown military campaigns. So long as the native population is busy fighting itself and not keeping an eye on either the Void or the Warp, the cult is serving its purpose. The Tyranids arrive, they do what they do best, while the hybrids and the infected humans, completely under the sway of the Broodmind and by now the Tyranid hive mind proper, fight alongside them. They are filled with a religious zeal, believing that their saviors have come at last to uplift them to some vague, exalted status among the stars. Of course, once all hostiles have been killed and consumed, that all comes to a screeching halt, as the hive mind directs the Tyranids and the extremely Tyranid-like hybrids, say the first and second generation type hybrids, to turn upon their erstwhile companions. The third and fourth generation hybrids, the mostly human hybrids, and the infected humans themselves are little more than prey, just like all the rest. Most of the time, the cultists get to experience a moment of horrified realization as their fellow broodmates turn on them, but there have also been instances of the hive mind directing the cultists to simply walk willingly into the digestion pools. Whichever way it ends, ultimately, to the hive mind, the cultists are just more biomatter to be consumed. There are dozens of known Genestealer cults throughout the galaxy. Possibly hundreds according to some speculations. Most cults are limited to a single community, or one planet at best. But a few, the most successful, have been able to spread their influence off-world, tainting and infecting human populations across entire sectors. At least 6 of these are officially recognized by the Inquisition's Ordo Xenos: the Hive Cult, the Cult of the Bladed Cog, the Inner Worm, the Pauper Princes, the Rusted Claw, and the Twisted Helix, each of which is worth a video in and of itself. Of course, by now you're wondering whether or not the Tyranids infect other beings and not just humans. Technically they do, but that's a very, very thin technically. In the tabletop game, the only kind of hybrids you ever really get are Tyranid-human hybrids. The real world reason is that this way Games Workshop doesn't have to make as many models for the game. In fairness though, they have managed to come up with some fairly convincing in-universe reasons as to why Tyranids almost exclusively prey on humanity. Firstly, humanity is the largest and most widespread species in the Milky Way, so naturally this would make them the most common prey of the Tyranids. But arguably the most important factor in why the Tyranids tend to favor them for Genestealer infiltration is because humanity is, oddly enough, despite being such a totalitarian state, one of the easiest to infiltrate. The Necrons are obviously out of the question because they're metal and have no biomatter to speak of. As for Chaos, the Tyranids can actually sense Chaos taint and avoid it like the plague. there have been several instances of Genestealer cults succumbing to chaos corruption. Naturally, the Patriarch sent out the psychic signal for the Hive fleet, but once the fleet came close enough to sense the chaos corruption, they immediately turned around and went in a different direction to avoid the planet and the Genestealers that had infested it. That just leaves the other major Xenos races, the Eldar, the Greenskins, and the Tau. While there used to be Orc-Tyranid hybrids in the very early editions of 40k, I'm talking all the way back to Rogue Trader days, they've mostly been retconned out of existence. Partly due to the fact that greenskins reproduce asexually by releasing spores from their skin on a regular basis. But also because greenskins, particularly the orcs, are especially good at detecting things that are decidedly un-orky and then crumping it. As for the Eldar, not only are they few in number, but with the Craftworlders being aboard floating ships in space that are able to constantly be on the move, and the Dark Eldar living almost entirely within the webway, it's simply very, very difficult for Genestealers to get at them. Obviously, the Exodite Maiden worlds are at risk, but the Eldar have become very, very good at hiding the locations of their Maiden worlds from others. The only known instance of Genestealer Eldar hybrids is a recent one, the case of the Eldar craft world Zaisuthra. Isolated in the warp after the fall of the Eldar, craftworld Zaisuthra was only recently discovered by the Inari. To their horror, the followers of Ivrain discovered that the craftworlders of Zaisuthra had been infested by Genestealers centuries ago. The logic of the Zaisuthra Eldar being that assimilation into the hive mind of the Tyranids was preferable to having their souls eaten by Slaanesh. Naturally, the Inari didn't see it that way and wiped them all out. Which leaves only the Tau. Fortunately for the little blueberries, they have several means of keeping out any kind of Genestealer infection. First, Tau are more advanced technologically than humans, including having the technology to detect such genetic abnormalities as a Genestealer implant. Second, they have certain alien allied species, such as the Kroot, that are able to detect the tainted genetic material even if the scanners do not. Third and finally, there is the fact that the Tau Empire, unlike the Imperium of Man, has a more efficient organization. Everything in the Empire, including reproduction, has government oversight. Tau are only permitted to reproduce with other Tau of the same caste, and only then when the powers that be declare that the greater good demands it. As such, if Genestealers tried to infest a local Tau sept, it wouldn't take long for the local leadership, usually the local ethereal lord, to notice that some of his citizens weren't acting in a manner conducive to the greater good, and take steps to either stop them or at least find out what was going on. That said, there have been noteworthy instances of Tau Genestealer infestation. The first occurred in 488 M41, when Hive Fleet Gorgon invaded the Tau Empire. The second occurred when several members of the Earth caste managed to get their hands on some Tyranid genetic material and, for the purposes of social experimentation, deliberately infected members of the local population simply to see what would happen. Even ignoring the ethical implications of such experiments, naturally the Genestealer cult that resulted from these, the so-called Earth caste rebels, led a major revolt on the sept in question. The rebellion was ultimately put down, but there have been some rumors, heavily suppressed by the authorities, that the Genestealer cult managed to produce a Tau ethereal hybrid. Given that the Tau are almost genetically programmed to obey the authority of the ethereal caste, the implications of such a thing would be disastrous for the Empire. I believe I once said long ago that 40k is a universe that is so horrible that all of the worst aspects of humanity can actually be justified in the name of survival. Naturally, one of those worst aspects is prejudice, the hatred of that which is different from ourselves. So, how do you make a universe so bad that such bigotry can be justified? Well, make it so that mutation is not only either a sign of corruption by the gods of chaos, eldritchian Lovecraftian horrors, but such mutations can also be the sign that your species is being infested by evil space locusts with teeth like dinosaurs. It really does prove the old joke. Star Wars fans would love to live in Star Wars. Star Trek fans would love to live in Star Trek. With stuff like the Genestealers, 40K fans would not want to live in 40K.